Hey folks, it's been a while since I've done one of these, and this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because it's something that I've personally had to overcome in my own language learning journey. I'm not going to call myself a master, but in the years since I've been doing this, I have learned a few things. I find vocabulary particularly difficult to learn. We can review stacks and stacks and stacks of flashcards and then come back the next day and have remembered next to nothing. And the problem with testing our vocabulary is that it generally doesn't reflect how we use that vocabulary. We tend to teach ourselves these long, isolated word lists when really we need to be putting these words into context, right? I don't speak in singular words. Do you? House, window, door. In adulthood, you will never have someone come up to you on the street and say something like, "Okay, give me the definition of superfluous. Go." It doesn't work like that. It's up to you to learn these vocabulary words and put them in context and not spend a superfluous amount of time memorizing them when the goal is actually fluidity. Aha, and now you have a better idea of what that word means without me giving you the definition. Checkmate. Although you might have known it before. That being said, here are some better ways to master vocabulary. So the first thing we need to talk about is finding the vocabulary lists. If you're a beginner, this is going to be the absolute easiest part of your learning. Sorry. Haven't learned basic food or family words? Well, now you know what to study. And there is no end to the amount of lists you can find on the internet. If you go to Google and type in most popular words of bleep language or vocabulary lists in bleep language, you'll have so many options to choose from. You can pick your favorite. This is the moment when the goal is most basic conversation. You want to be able to do things like introduce yourself, talk about where you're from, your family, maybe the friends you have, or if you have any pets, or even basic likes and dislikes. Later in the beginning stages of your learning, you can focus on more specific things, such as like where you might want to travel, or basic body parts maybe, or foods, I don't know. Hone in a little more specifically. But what you want to avoid is lists of vocabulary that you're not even going to use, or that you're not going to use yet. I've talked about this so many times, but even in like Duolingo or most public schools, you learn things like fingers before you learn the word for my friend, or I want to go to Italy next summer. It's just not the best use of your time. And when you reach the intermediate and advanced levels, you shouldn't even really need to consult vocabulary lists at all. You should be looking for vocabulary out in the wild, out where language is fully formed and used. Reading, watching media, it's really a great way to pick out the language that is common and popular in context that you're not necessarily aware of at this current moment. So those are just my little tips for finding the vocabulary lists, but let's get on to the methods of learning. Like I said earlier, flashcards are definitely one of the most common ways of doing things, but I urge you to think a little more outside of the box. It's a great way to memorize, but not necessarily a great way to, absorb the actual language. One method I hear about over and over and over again, kind of in direct contradiction to using flashcards, is the no random words method. Basically what that refers to is when you take out your little index card and you write one word on one side and the other word in your language on the other side. Essentially, that is a word floating in an abstract background in like a Klimt painting or something like that. It has no meaning other than the direct regurgitation of the definition on the other side of the card. That is simply not it, Chief. It is so much more difficult to draw out that vocabulary word that you spent so much time learning when you're in a conversation with a random person, because you know what you want to say, but what you've done is you've effectively isolated that word on a random blank sheet of paper and not put it in its context. People don't think in random words, but full phrases and sentences. So why are we learning it like it's one word at a time, when the goal is really to communicate as fluidly as possible? Because you're like chopping up the language into little bits, and that's just not how we communicate, right? Another method that I will endorse is like visualizing, and this is pretty straightforward, I will say. But instead of writing any sort of definition, having a picture of it in your head, or like really if you're so inclined to do flashcards, instead of writing that definition in your language on the other side of the card, you would draw your own little picture, and that's far more valuable. That takes so much more mental effort, which is why it's more difficult. There have been so many studies that show that writing out a word on a piece of paper is far more valuable to your retention than typing it on a computer. Think of how much better it is when you draw it out and you're thinking of that word in the other language. Because really, when you switch between languages, it's like switching between different pieces in your brain. You don't want to have to translate in your brain. You want to have that image prepared. Now, I will say when you come to more abstract nouns, it gets a little trickier, you know, like maybe you're learning the word abstract. How, I invite you, dear audience member, to give me a picture of abstraction. I mean, I guess that would be easy, you know, if you want to reference artists or whatever, but ultimately that would be for your own benefit. It would be tricky to that. You get what I'm saying. And now we've come to my absolute favorite way of learning vocabulary, and that is etymology. So I will say that this is probably the most painstaking route to go, but it's so much more useful for you and your learning. If there's a word you're trying to learn and it sounds like, or maybe it's spelled similarly to a word you already know in your own language or another language, the likelihood is that somewhere in the history of the development of this word, there's overlap. And it's usually a really fascinating story. There's a lot of speculation that the word bistro, meaning, you know, small, cheap-ish restaurant, usually French, a lot of people seem to think that that word actually comes from the Russian word bistro, which means like fast, because what happened is when a huge wave of Russian immigrants came to France, they didn't want to sit as long as the French like to do. They wanted to make it quick, so these, you know, Russian immigrants would say bistro, and suddenly all these restaurants became kind of a different style of French dining, when the predominant French style of dining is take 3+ hours to enjoy your meal. I don't know if that's true or not. My Russian friend and also Wikipedia seems to think so. Either way, I like this story, and even if I didn't know the word bistro, that would help me learn it. And now I know it in Russian, so that's exciting. Another part of this method I would like to talk about is that while it does take some time to learn the meaning and the history of each individual word, really you're not going one by one, because when you learn one word, you're really learning a whole bunch of other forms of that word. If we take the word friend, for example, you can subsequently learn words like friendship, friends, befriend, friendly. Suddenly now you're aware of abstract nouns, plurals, verbs, adjectives, and it's already strengthened your knowledge of the original word that we were looking at. So I encourage you to dig deeper on each word, spend more time on each word than just one side word, other side definition. If you really feel like lonely word lists are something that helps you and that's just your style of learning, then I strongly suggest at least writing out the lists. Like I said, studies have proved that your retention is so much higher when you write it out by hand. Back in high school, when we were learning vocabulary, when we were doing all that kind of stuff, and the point was more memorization than retention, I would use a method called the accordion. It was really cute. It's basically where you take a piece of paper and write down all of the words you want to learn in one vertical column on the edge of your paper, and then go to the space to the right of it and write down the definition. If it's another language, it should be 1 or 2 words maybe. Maybe you could do synonyms, but basically it shouldn't be more than 2 or 3 words. Once you had the second vertical column, you'd fold over the first so you couldn't see it, and then basically you'd recreate it until you've mastered both the word and its definition, or the word and its synonyms, whatever you're learning. Once you unfold the paper, it's like an accordion. Really cute. And one thing I like about that is you can see exactly what you need to work on, exactly what you still have yet to learn. I found that to be extremely helpful. Another thing I like to do is if I have a collection of like 5 or 6 vocabulary words, I'll simply write a story that pertains, that kind of draws some sort of connection that's helpful to put into context. I try to write every day about whatever it is that's on my mind. And when I come to a word or, a grammar point even that I'm not sure of, add it to the list. You know what I mean? That's a perfect way to master vocab, because this is vocabulary that you're meeting in use, that you will use because you're currently attempting to use it. All in all, I think isolated word lists are overrated. I think flashcards are overrated. I think there are so many better uses of your time. And I recommend so hard, if there's nothing else you take away from this video, put the language into context. Ditch the index cards or the Anki or the Quizlet or whatever you use. Write a paragraph. Even if it's on the computer, that's fine, because at least you're using the words, you're learning how to conjugate the verbs, you're learning how to spell it, you're learning all these things, and it's not some random word floating in space. Please don't isolate the words. Anyways, this has been so much fun. I hope you had a good time, that you learned something maybe, or at least got you thinking about learning a little bit. Yeah. I will see you real soon. Love you, bye.
We're sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service at this time.